Peter Fox-Penner is here to talk about the smart grid, the subject of a book he has just written, and I think it's released this month. I've known him since 1973 when he was a student of mine in a course at the University of Illinois.
I wish I could be there in person. This is the first, actually the first talk of I'm going to give on Smart Power, my new book, and I jumped at the chance to do it at the Solution Seminar at the University of Vermont because Bob is correct. He is guilty of getting me involved in energy and environmental policy in any sort of formal way. I dabbled in it like any normal person might until I met him. And then it was downhill from there into a career of energy and environmental policy. Bob was, back in 1973, was a renegade physicist. That will shock you all to know, those of you who know him now. Bob Costanza, I think, was in graduate school then, and soon came to the University of Illinois and brought these fantastic maps of Florida. But I just want to tell one story about it, about those days. Bob told me I had to do, and everybody in our class, a term paper, sort of a research paper, and I chose to do it on the Abbott power plant, which was the University of Illinois' cogeneration plant. At that time, very few people, well, people were just starting to talk about the need for greater energy efficiency. It was it was actually Project Independence under Richard Nixon, where we were starting to think about our energy policies because of the Arab oil shocks of the 1970s. Carter was yet to come, but that is President Carter. But so I chose to do a paper about this rather unusual power plant that made both steam and power. And the subject of the power plant was to compute the overall energy efficiency of the power plant, draw a system boundary and look at the energy going in and the energy going out. And it was, as Bob probably remembers the number better than me, but it was in the 90s. And of course, all of you guys know that regular power plants, simple cycle power plants as they're now known, have an efficiency of 35%. So this was quite fantastic. But the great thing about this paper was that I got to be friendly with the union workmen who ran the power plant, who had never before in their careers seen any student interest in their power plants. So they invited us to come back to the power plant. They were there 24/7 and usually bored, so it was quite a fun evening to go hit the bars and then late at night to go by the power plant and have them give us a tour of these big throbbing turbines and boilers and things like that. The kind of fun only energy wonks could possibly think of, the kind of experience only energy wonks could possibly think of as fun. Anyway, since then, as I said, it's been downhill into a life of energy and environmental policy, ending up in Washington, going through the Department of Energy and Office of Science and Technology Policy and some other things. And let me first say why I wrote the book, because I think it goes to the purpose of the kind of solutions program that you guys have up there. About 2 or 3 years ago, I was quite downcast about energy and environmental policies in the United States. This is when I reconnected with Bob and started talking about writing an energy policy book, which he was very encouraging about. And of course, I got rejected by all sorts of publishers. Okay. Well, I'll do a shorter version of it. I was originally going to write an energy policy book because I really felt prior to Obama's election that American energy policy was just, to use an appropriate metaphor, driving straight off the cliff. An absence of, not only an absence of a climate policy, but genuine negative force in global climate policies. Absolute indifference to our energy security and our dependence on oil. And innumerable other bad energy and environmental policies, in my view. But along came Obama's election and created the best. The energy policies he ran on were far better than I thought any president would ever get elected on. I have followed presidential elections and the energy policies advocated by presidents very closely. And in fact, that was going to be the subject of the book. And so in a file cabinet, I have every presidential candidate's energy platform dating back to Carter. And Obama's was by far the strongest at a time when I thought the American electorate did not have an appetite for strong and progressive energy policies. But you might remember when candidate Clinton, I'm sorry for this diversion, but candidate Clinton recommended a gasoline tax holiday in the May price spike that always occurs in the gasoline markets, and Obama caused quite a big stir by saying, no, I don't think it's a good idea. And he didn't lose traction over that, which I was greatly surprised and reassured by. So while this was happening, I happened to get a consulting assignment to look at the future investment needs of the power sector. And it was really an assignment directed at Wall Street. How much money is the power industry going to need to raise on Wall Street? And at the time, I just thought it was, you know, the kind of assignment that Brattle Group gets hired for. We're very good at it. We do a lot of utility planning, and we also have a finance practice, so we understand utility finance very, very well. It's a founding core competency of the firm. So I went ahead and did it, but it got me thinking about the future of the industry. And I'd just been thinking about American energy policy, and what hit me in a flash became the subject of the book. And what hit me is this. While the new administration is putting the country on a new path, a very different path of energy and environmental policies, the utility industry plays an integral role in many of those policies, more even than before. It used to be that whatever policy we adopted regarding energy security and foreign oil and even domestic oil had nothing to do with the power sector. We get less than 1% of our power from oil. But now, as we're on the cusp of electrifying transport, the power industry is now integral to effectuating this new, and I think much cleaner and more secure and ultimately more efficient form of transport. What I realized is that the changes that were hitting the industry all at once from a number of different directions were threatened to destabilize the power industry, much like it was destabilized in the 1970s. And the kind of destabilization that would happen to it would actually, I think, hamper our ability to adopt the environmental policies, or to make them, not so much to adopt them, but to make them work. And that would interfere with the policy's success. And so that I began to think that keeping the utility industry that the utility industry would have to change dramatically, and I'll talk some more about that. And that those changes were going to be very complex and controversial, and in some cases wrenching for regulation and also for Wall Street. But that if we didn't make the transition well, that climate policies and electrifying our transport and energy efficiency policies and all these things would get tied up, even perhaps for decades. And those of you who lived through the 1970s and watched the utility industry carefully, as I ended up having to do somewhat by accident, saw that a lot of things just ground to a halt or got really tied up. And the potential for that sort of problem is much, much greater now, because the changes and the challenges besetting the power industry are much, much greater than they were in the 70s. So my point here overall is to say that, in a sense, I see that helping the utility industry change to a dramatically different form is integral to achieving energy and environmental policies in the climate space, in energy efficiency, in renewable energy, and in electrifying transport. And in that sense, to quote Eldridge Cleaver in the era that Bob and I first knew each other, the utility industry needs to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. So that's why I wrote the book. I'm getting a message here. Oh, just pick something vegetarian. Yeah, fine. Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks. And it's on me. So let me next talk about what these major challenges and changes are that are hitting the power industry. And now we can go to the first slide, I think. Let me just check. Yeah. The title of this slide is Bringing Renewables Onto the Grid. But the challenge overall, I would characterize as decarbonizing the grid. I believe that no matter what happens in the next few months in the United States Congress, as somebody who lives in Washington and has been watching the climate change issue get negotiated and batted around politically, I believe, and I think virtually every person in the power industry and probably even the energy industry believes that the United States will soon enact national climate policies that put a price on carbon. And I certainly think we need to, for a variety of reasons. It's a moral imperative for us as a nation and a culture, but it's also come to the point where it's hurting the economy, and it's hurting even the very energy producers and electric utilities who some people argue are going to be hurt by this legislation. But in fact, the industry, without question, accepts that this imperative exists, and the industry wants to get on with it. It wants to understand the rules of the road. The delays in adopting climate legislation are hampering its ability to plan, hampering its ability to invest. And so I think it's very important that we do this. It would be fantastic if the Senate passed a bill in the next few months, or in a lame duck session, or worst case next year. I'm certainly pushing for that as hard as I can. But even if we don't do it next year, it will happen within the next few years. And that will set off a need for the industry to go on a path of what I call decarbonization of the generation fleet in the book. And this is partly what the assignment was for the Edison Foundation. The scale of the investment needed to do this is enormous. Somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion between now and 2050. It's an enormous amount of money to spend, and it will be spent, I think, on a variety of lower carbon sources, in some cases no carbon sources. One of the things the book does is to take a look at various different estimates and projections of what sort of mix of renewables and other low carbon sources will be in the fleet, as we say in the utility business, between now and 2050, and how that will change. It's not the primary purpose of the book. The book simply stops at concluding that I don't believe that we will have a 100% renewable fleet by 2050. At the same time, I think the jury is out on how much nuclear we have. I think we'll build a couple of nuclear plants that are well along the way, but I don't know how many more. The purpose of the book was not to crystal ball gaze and to say, oh, I can predict the mix of generation. What I'm confident predicting is that the mix of generation will step by step take carbon out of electric utility emissions down to about an 80% reduction by 2050, and that there will be a variety of sources used, and that it will take a substantial sum of money. What you see on this slide is 3 projections of how much capacity will be added between now and just 2030. And you can see that the estimates are very different. The first one is actually our estimate that we did 2 years ago, and it's quite dated. And it's a little similar to EIA in that there's 220,000 megawatts about of capacity added, and you can see that the middle bar. Let me say what the bars are. The first bar is our estimate. The middle bar is an EIA estimate, and EIA is generally conservative, and particularly conservative as to the cost of nuclear and its prospects. And then the third bar is EPA's study of the future of the industry under Waxman-Markey. And I think that is by far the most realistic of any of these scenarios. Our scenario is pretty conventional. You see a lot of renewables, a little bit of coal with, we assume carbon capture and sequestration is available by 2020. And then we were, in this particular study, pretty favorable towards nuclear, new nuclear as in its costs. In the middle bar, you see that there are more, the retirements of units are below the zero line. And the retirements are all old coal and steam plants in the middle bar. Then you have about the same renewables as we find, and they find a little more nuclear and more combined cycle, and they did not assume coal with CCS is available. And I'm not saying either of these are right. In fact, these two, I think, are both dated, and I don't particularly put a lot of belief in either of them. The next one is EPA's forecast under Waxman-Markey. And the first thing you notice is that there's only 60,000 megawatts built between now and 2030. And almost all of it's renewables. There's a little coal with CCS, and then you have a lot of retirements of oil and natural gas steam. I think this is the best of the projections. But what you see here is that the industry is retiring old, inefficient oil and gas and coal plants and building renewables and maybe a little coal and CCS. This is through 2030. You also see that the industry is building a lot less than 220,000 megawatts. The reason it's building less is that Waxman-Markey has very good energy efficiency policies in it, very strong ones, and they lower the rate of growth of sales in the power industry substantially, and I'm going to get to that in a moment, because I think that is a huge paradigm-shifting change for the power industry. And in fact, if you can see the third bar, you're almost retiring as much as you build. There's very little growth in sales, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. But even with very small amounts of construction, comparatively speaking, when you look at the costs per megawatt and the need to build transmission and things like that, I think, realistically have to spend at least $500 billion of new investment in generation and or transmission, just in capital costs. And that is a huge factor hitting the industry, and it's very important. I think the next slide, I think I'm going to skip it in the interest of time, because I think I am falling behind here with too much storytelling. So if you want to quickly skip over that decarbonizing generation slide, those are the various costs of the different generation technologies, and you can see that in the book. Also, I think you're going to post these slides on your website, and I'm going to post them on the Smart Power Book website, so they'll all be there for you to see. And In the Q&A session, we can go back to them. But I next want to turn to something that I've touched on that I think is just as important as the decarbonization of generation, and that's energy efficiency policies. I think that energy efficiency policy is the linchpin of any good national climate strategy, and it's really the linchpin of any good energy policy, even if you weren't worried about climate change. And I'm sure, as all of you know, the United States has a mediocre at best track record at energy efficiency. And in my view, at a 100,000-foot level, it's because we have very complex and I will call them somewhat muddled energy efficiency policies, in the sense that we have low energy prices, so we don't send price signals. We price electricity at average costs, which tends to make it cheaper in the times when it's really expensive. That is, we average out peak and off-peak prices in the way we price electricity. But beyond that, there are many reasons why we price energy very low. And in addition to that, we have relatively weak codes and standards and governmental funding of energy efficiency programs, although you guys in Vermont are a real exception to that. And in the Q&A, we can probe whether or why Vermont is or isn't a good model for the rest of the country. I do talk some about that in the book. But talking about the nation as a whole, our energy policies and energy efficiency policies are weak. And the third reason is that we rely on electric utilities of all types for a fair amount of energy efficiency deployment, even in Vermont, either using them as sources of capital or sources of actually deploying them or giving rebates or giving advice. There's lots of things utilities can do in energy efficiency, but all of those missions fundamentally conflict with their shareholder profit motive. And even for public utilities, I find a surprising degree of hesitation at doing energy efficiency. Now, of course, there are exceptions, and some of them are in Vermont. But overall, it's particularly bad for the investor-owned utilities, but it's bad overall. And that has to do with the way we set our utilities up, and that's a lot of what needs to change. So we have these weak energy efficiency policies for a variety of reasons, and the way I sort of characterize in the book is that there is no one institution or entity kind of driving the train for energy efficiency. Different places in different cities and regions and states, there's leadership. In your case, I think the leadership comes from at the state level, although the utilities are very progressive, but that's unique. In most other places, the leadership isn't clear and there isn't that much leadership. So I think that needs to change. And I think that's very, very important. Now, but one of the things that I noticed, this is at the time Waxman-Markey was coming out, is that Waxman-Markey basically mandated all sorts of energy efficiency. And even without those mandates, I started to study the future of electricity sales when the industry would go and spend this $500 billion on new generation and transmission, which would raise prices. Even at the low level we set rates would go up in real terms, and that tends to reduce sales. And so I think the next slide shows total electric industry sales, and this is only out through 2030, but it gives you a feeling of what I think is changing so dramatically in the industry. Another thing, maybe the very first thing Bob Herendeen told me, I think, Bob, is, Peter, you have to understand exponential growth. This was at the time the original limits to growth study just came out. And the first formula Bob Herendeen ever showed me was exponential compounding. And he said, Pete, power sales are growing in this country 7% a year. What I want you to remember is 7% a year growth means doubling every 10 years. Is that right, Bob? I hope so. So
He said, yes, you're right.
yes, okay,
You
good.
passed
I can only hear you. I can't hear. And that's how much electricity was growing way back then, which wasn't really that long ago. It seems like only yesterday to me. Well, if you look at actual electricity growth, here we are, not that much later in the future. 2000 to 2008 growth, the top line on this total electricity sales slide is 1.06% a year. It's down to 1%. So that's actual growth. And that's pretty much not counting the recession / depression we just lived through, or really we're living through. You can see that on the chart, but that growth rate mostly predates that. EIA now predicts, and EIA is, as I said, conservative. They predict, and this is under current policies, this is before any climate policy changes, before we spend $500 billion on new electric capital and raise rates. They say electricity is only going to grow 0.8% a year. The Electric Power EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, did a forecast that we helped work on that factors in energy efficiency potential, but not by no means the maximum energy efficiency potential electric utilities could reach, but a healthy potential. That drops the forecast to 0.67% a year. And in the book, you will see that I kind of dissect these forecasts and the prices that they're based on, and I conclude that it is well within the realm of possibility, and particularly if we pass energy efficiency policies, anything like those that the House of Representatives has already passed, that we will get close to zero sales growth through 2030 and possibly even through 2050. And when I first came to that conclusion, I just shook my head and I said, this is a revolution. The power industry has never in its history seen anything close to zero growth in sales. It's just not how the industry is structured. It's not how its finances is structured. It's not how its regulations are all really essentially based on sales growth. Its political economy is based on sales growth, and sales growth is going away. And when I have talked to a number of electric utility CEOs, and I have raised this possibility, whereas it used to be over the last few decades when I would talk about a steady state economy or any of those things, they would shake their heads and look at me like I was a radical. And these days, this generation of utility executives, they're not surprised by this. And they want to think about this. I think they think they're a little more bullish than 0%, but they know that electricity is no longer a fast-growing industry. It's a slow-growing industry, even with electric vehicle sales. So this is a giant shift for the industry. There's a third giant challenge hitting the industry, and that's the one Bob mentioned in his introduction, which is the smart grid. People tend to think that my book, Smart Power, is only about the smart grid, but as you can undoubtedly tell by now, it's not just about the smart grid. But one of the big paradigm-busting changes to hit the industry is the smart grid. Broadly speaking, the smart grid is the application of IT to the power system. And what it's going to do is to change the way that the power grid is managed at the bulk power level. The degree of controllability over the system will go up by an order of magnitude because the information that power grid controllers have is much, much better than they've had in the past. But at the level of the customer and the customer's interface with the utility, the change will be even more dramatic. And I call that portion of the smart grid the downstream smart grid. And there, as many of you know from watching videos and listening to other speeches and talks and websites and lots of hype about this, the smart grid will allow us to get all kinds of real-time pricing information and get real-time control signals, program many of our end uses to respond to price signals or utility controls. One good example is that right now, I think it's about a third of the water heaters on the island of Oahu are controlled by their electric utility. And when there's any threat to reliability of the grid, they can drop water heaters off the grid and bring them back. That's an idea that dates back to the 1970s called load management. But this can be done on a scale and speed and sophistication that's far beyond what we could do in the 1970s. And it can be done with customers' own programming and control. It will also allow the power company to be something like the internet, where you can plug solar panels into the grid right at your house much more easily than you can today, and sell the power back to the grid. You can charge your car, and there's just much more functionality in the grid, much more customer communication, much more ability to control your energy use. However, this will contribute to energy efficiency, although that is not the most dramatic impact of the smart grid. I think the smart grid will reduce the rate of electricity sales growth, and you can see by how much in the book, in my decomposition of sales growth changes. But it's the fact that the electric utility business model and regulation of electric rates and electric practices is all based on a passive grid, very simple pricing. And when you introduce a smart grid, you can't regulate utilities the way you used to. Utilities can't run their finances the way they used to, and they can't run their operations the way they used to. So when you add up these three factors hitting utilities, the gestalt that came to me was that utilities, as we know them, simply can't survive in their current form. They won't survive this transition in their current form. They're gonna have to transition to something, and the goal of the book, in a nutshell, is to facilitate that transition and to keep it from being kind of a train wreck that hampers all of these otherwise very, very positive developments. So the second half of the book, you might say, is a look at what utilities can evolve into. And the way I look at it is really a combination. It really grows out of the strange viewpoint and career I've had, where I'm a bit of a environmental policy wonk. I have a degree in economics, although it's a bit accidental, but it's an enormously important toolkit, particularly when talking to regulators and analyzing how industries change. And I'm a bit of a political economist. I've always loved politics since my childhood. So when I think about the industry, and I think this is the next slide, I create this concept, or I name this concept, it's nothing new, called the industry's triad. And to me, the power industry is, in the power industry, the structure of the industry, so I hope you're on the next slide, the industry's inseparable triad. The industry's structure, and when economists say structure, we mean the size of firms, the boundary of firms, what is it that this firm does, and what is it that it doesn't do, and the next firm in the value chain does. How many of these firms are? Is it a franchise monopoly, or is there competition? Is there vertical integration? All of those things are what we call the structure of the firm. That's, in the power industry, inextricably tied to what parts of the industry are regulated and how they're regulated, and what parts of the industry are quote unquote deregulated, although deregulation is a misnomer in the power industry and it will remain a misnomer. The closest you come is I use the term price deregulated, and even that's not quite accurate. But the mix of markets and regulation is the second part of the triad. And the third part of the triad is the business model of the regulated or deregulated entity. What product does it sell? How does it charge for it? What's its marketing strategy and all that sort of thing? Now, the traditional triad, which is what I conclude just can't survive this transition, and there's nothing bad about that. That's a good thing because it needs to go. But the traditional triad, all of you are very familiar with it. It's pretty much franchised utilities. And in about a third to a quarter of the country, you have franchised distribution companies and regulated transmission companies, and you have retail choice. But in 2/3 of the country, I think including Vermont, you have a pretty much a vertically integrated utility selling kilowatt hours. And you have it regulated by the state for most functions. Still, distribution utilities are still very pervasively regulated by their state commissions and using a very simple cost of service model. And there's lots of tweaks and bells and whistles on it, but at the end of the day, the fundamental economics of the model is that it's cost of service. And you have a business model with it. And the business model is real simple. Sell more power, sell it as cheap as you can, and make your money off what used to be called regulatory lag or rate-based investments in supply-side resources. What I hope is the main contribution of the book is to suggest how this triad might evolve into new industry forms that are consistent with and complementary to achieving the energy policy goals that I think are so important. Climate policies, decarbonizing the grid, more renewables, much more energy efficiency, and enabling the smart grid to function. I'm going to skip over, in the interest of time, a lot of discussion in the book about what all the potential pitfalls are along the transition. I think the regulatory challenges and some of the financial challenges are mind-boggling. But I will jump to the end and just briefly show you the two, what I call them, models for the utilities of the future. And what I'm showing you is something like a quick snapshot of the triad, but really looking at the triad from the standpoint of the kind of utility that will exist within that triad. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the first one, which I call the smart integrator. If you write a book, you have to have clever, memorable names for things. So one kind of utility is a smart integrator, and really, an easy way to think about this is that it's the evolution of retail choice utilities now into a smart grid era. But here you continue to have regulated companies own the distribution systems, that is the wires, and the transmission system, and those both remain regulated with regulation that's not that different from today, but it has to become more of an incentive or performance-based regulatory system. And that's not a gigantic paradigm shift, but it's, as you can read in chapter 5 of the book, it will be extremely challenging for those regulated entities. But they retreat out of the retail sales business and become just the power backbone and also the information backbone. And information and power flows will have to flow in parallel in order to enable the smart grid. And they give you they become the portal that you plug into, and all of the widgets and all of the control systems and all of the retailing of services and probably all of the energy efficiency technologies will come from the quote-unquote deregulated private sector. Now, the degree that it's deregulated, I think, will be open to question, just as it is in every so-called deregulated state. But here, the paradigm is mainly that utilities retreat into becoming the information and energy portal and the price signalers, and they operate and integrate everything in the system, but they stay out of the last mile, to use the telecom term, and they become largely invisible to customers, and customers interface with deregulated or at least different entities. And this is the vision that I think many kind of free market advocates have for the future of the smart grid. It builds on their vision, their original 20-year-old vision for retail choice. It's being advocated, for example, in Texas quite strongly, and by some people. There's a book called Perfect Power that some of you might have heard of. So this is one future model, and I do think it's quite likely that there will be, well, first of all, I don't think either one of these two models will be monolithic. And again, my crystal ball is too cloudy to see which one will ultimately triumph. But the second model, if you go to the next slide, and really the last one, is what I call the energy services utility. And here, electric utilities do something that's has been talked about since Amory Lovins and Roger Sant and others raised it in the 1970s, and that is utilities stop selling kilowatt hours and they start selling energy services. That is, they move forward into the customer's home and business and say, look, we're not here to sell you kilowatt hours, although we do sell them, but we're here to sell you light and heat, or as Amory has often said, what does the consumer want? A warm house and cold beer. We're here to sell you those services. It's very complicated to regulate this and to determine where competition would be allowed and where the utilities would have an exclusive franchise. It's very complicated to set prices on this. Intellectually, I love this model. And I wrote a paper on it separately that probably, I think you guys, some of you have seen in the Harvard Business Review last July. But I think the regulatory problems are huge in both of these scenarios, and maybe the political economy of this is difficult. But I also think this is superior for energy efficiency, because I think utilities can deploy capital in this scenario for energy efficiency purposes better than I think anyone in the smart integrator scenario. So the policy side of me really does not want to jettison this particular model. And once again, to my surprise, when I was talking to many utility CEOs when I was writing Smart Power, I mentioned these two models, and I expected them to be disinterested in this and sort of write it off as a bridge too far. And what they said is, traditionally we utilities have been no good at doing anything beyond the meter. We've failed pretty much anytime we've tried to do that. But we don't like the smart integrator model that much, because we become nothing to the customers. We just become this invisible internet backbone. And we don't like that idea, and we don't want to give up on this model either just yet. And so I think both of these models are starting to get debated in the industry, and one of my goals for the book was to get the industry to wrap their arms around these things in advance of any financial maelstrom, and so that the industry could be ready for all of the things that are hitting it and going to hit it, and be prepared to change. I also think that regulators, particularly state regulators, need to be starting to think hard about this, and many of them are, but as you can tell from my remarks, a continuing theme in the book Smart Power, and something I get up and truly think about, worry about every day, is that the regulatory challenges, just in the transition, just in regulators going to their legislatures or the governors and saying, let go of this, deregulate it, it's going to be fine. Or we need to set the following boundaries on this market and then it'll be fine. That's what I do for a living nowadays. It's what Brattle Group does for a living, and I think we're in the cutting edge of that. But the challenges in doing this are way beyond anything we've ever seen in our careers. So there's a number of recommendations in the book, but I'll just close with one that I think is probably the most unique among recommendations rolling around out there, and that is that the federal government establish a academy and an accreditation program for energy policymakers, and particularly for energy regulators, state and federal, and should be open to lots of other people as well, to equip them and to start to study how you do the transition to these, because it's going to take a tremendous amount of experimentation and resources, and many state commissions just don't have the resources to do this, and I think they need them. So I think that's a very important tactical step we should take to equip and provision the industry for change and its regulators. Let me just stop there. It's pretty awkward to talk to the screen this long, and you guys have been very patient. And I think I'll end there, and I'd be more than happy to take questions. And thank you very much for putting up with this. I really apologize for it. I was quite stunned to step out of the plane in LaGuardia at 7 this morning and find out that my bag had left and I hadn't. But thank you very much for this, and apologies. And if you'll have me, I'd like to come back in the fall in the person and not do a formal talk like this, but just come around and take a bike ride with Bob.
Thanks, Peter. You can see a little bit of the audience there now, I think, on your computer, and we have at least 5 or 10 minutes for questions. So,
Peter, this is Paul Hines, and I'm a smart grid researcher here at UVM, and so I'm really interested in the idea of zero growth in demand, but I'm kind of curious whether that might be in conflict with the idea that transportation could get electrified. So roughly, transportation is sort of, in rough numbers, the same amount of energy as electricity consumption, and changing it to electricity doesn't change the energy consumption all that much. And so if you have electrify 5% of transportation by 2030, you would roughly increase electricity demand by 5%. And so that means that other growth has to go down by 5%. So is that what you're envisioning, or am I off base?
No, that's basically what I'm envisioning. And I would, first of all, there's some projections of plug-in hybrids in the paper, and we looked at the idea of getting 1 million hybrids on the road by 2016, which I think is Obama's goal, or 2015, and the prospects for doing that and how much they would likely use. I think that it will take a little longer for plug-in hybrids to penetrate than the most bullish scenarios. And I think after 2030, you will see much more use of electricity for hybrids. So this slide is a little misleading. But in a nutshell, electric vehicle growth is the big new demand source for power, and everything else pretty much gets more efficient. And when you and in simple terms, I may be wrong, and Paul, take a look at my numbers, and I know Bob Herendeen will, and maybe I've got them wrong, but rough, everything else gets about more efficient as fast as electric vehicles penetrate.
great. Peter, I have a question. So you probably know about Efficiency Vermont here.
Yes.
The sort of efficiency utility. Is that model something that you think can and should be replicated elsewhere to sort of separate the efficiency generation from the power generation?
Well, can and should are different things, Bob. You guys live in the paradise, the ecotopia of Vermont. And I think Efficiency Vermont is a fantastic thing, but I don't think, politically speaking, I don't see it very easily replicated outside of Vermont. One of the things I was looking forward to doing, and I'll have to wait for the fall, is to get hearing more from you guys, not in this formal lecture, but offline, about the latest on what's going on with Efficiency Vermont. And maybe I would learn something and change my view, but as it stands today, I just think that most state governments don't have the ambition, resources, or budgets, or just ability to fashion something as progressive as Efficiency Vermont.
Except maybe Oregon.
You know, I think a handful of states may well do it, but beyond that handful, it would take a national push. And if we could do that, it's great, but I don't see that at the national level in an era of very progressive national policies.
Well, maybe just a quick follow-up. So if, you know, you could overcome those political problems, do you think an institution like Efficiency Vermont, if it were replicated in all the states, would that achieve the efficiency goals that you're talking about?
Yes, I think one option that I in chapter 10 I talk about quite a lot in the book is that utilities don't have to be the principal agent for energy efficiency, but I think someone needs to be the leader and the funder and the real champion for energy efficiency. And about the only alternative to utilities doing it is, I think, state agencies like Efficiency Vermont. And that would be, I think, I would be perfectly happy with that. And it would take a burden off the utilities. The utilities would just have to live with lower sales, but they wouldn't have to finance energy efficiency on their balance sheets. And that works. Then it gets financed on the balance sheets of state governments, or a kind of hybrid model, I think, like you guys have. But it would work. I'm not sure we'll get there.
Okay.
So I've heard of some creative solutions, like particularly using hybrid electric battery cars to kind of store electricity at certain times of the day and then release it back onto the grid at, like, I guess, peak hours. Is that something that is still being talked about, and are there kind of like more creative solutions that expand on that idea that you might suggest?
Yeah. By the way, tell me who you are, if you don't mind, when you ask the questions.
My name's Marty Fry.
Marty?
Fry.
Right. And are you a student or?
Yeah, I'm a third year undergrad here, UVM.
Okay, great. Well, Marty, there's a lot of talk of the use of hybrid car batteries to put power back onto the grid, so-called V2G, or vehicle to grid. There is certainly some of that, a little bit of that will happen. But at least from everything I understand, and my colleagues at the Brattle Group, who are very deep into this, and you know, our customer base, or we call them clients, is pretty much probably half the utilities in North America are our clients. And so we talk to them quite a lot about it. And for both engineering reasons, and this even comes from the car companies as well, for engineering reasons as well as economic reasons, just in terms of the value of the power put back on the grid, we don't see selling power back from your car battery into the grid as a big value creation. I think some of it will happen, but overall, the economics of doing it, when we crunch the numbers, are you don't make that much money as a car owner. You won't be, because you would just make the money on the differential in prices. And although there are some steep differentials now, over time we see those differentials becoming much flatter. And then there's technical reasons and there's costs of getting the power back out of your vehicle into the grid. And it also is going to make vehicles more expensive and add a lot of technical things in. So this is a long-winded way of saying, Marty, we don't see that as a major factor in the future. Maybe you'll get some what are known as ancillary services off cars, which help manage the grid, but it doesn't seem to be a big factor. But that doesn't mean I'm not bullish on plug-in hybrids. I just think hybrids, I think, are going to be fantastic cars. Even if you don't sell any power back, they're going to be much more efficient and help our energy security, even if they just are sources, or rather sinks, rather than sources of power.
Hi, Peter. Bob Herendeen. When we have solar panels on everybody's roof, why do we need a grid at all?
Well, first of all, I don't think we're ever going to put solar panels on everybody's roof. Or let's put it this way, the very first briefing I had at the Department of Energy when I went into energy efficiency and renewables is the buildings guys, and they said, Peter, there's about a 100-year time constant in the turnover of the American building stock. And you've got to think in those terms if you want to think about, full transformation of buildings. Maybe it's a little faster now because we build worse buildings, but both because I think retrofitting's expensive, and I think there are still economies of scale. I don't see a future in which everybody puts solar panels in little bits on every rooftop. Instead, I think communities will aggregate, and maybe even public power will aggregate for us, and large roofs will have them. But I think it will be a long time. In the second half of the century, all bets are off, and my crystal ball is useless then. But I think it'll be a long time before they do it. But I do think that the scale of the typical power generator, which was basically what in the days that you and I hung out, Bob, was 1,000 megawatts, it moved down to about 500 megawatts average, 5 to 300 in the last few years. I think it's going to continue to move down so that the average installation is maybe 50 to 200 megawatts, or maybe even 20 to 200. And while I think we will continue to need the grid for backup and security and things like that through 2050, the amount of incremental large-scale grid we will need, Bob, will decrease, and in the later half of the century, will probably, by 2100, we'll probably be able to not need it at all, maybe. But when I run the numbers and look at the rate of change and that sort of thing, I just think that the grid will become less critical, but slowly.
Hi, I'm Michaela McDonald. I'm an undergrad here, and I just recently found out that all of the Vermont utilities applied for the stimulus act for $69 million for smart grid implementation, and with a matching fund from the utilities. And so I was just wondering if you know what the progress on this has been so far. This happened in October. I think they received the funds. And do you see, their goal is to get, smart grid technology implemented by 2012. And do you see that implementation of the smart meters and also the transmission and distribution as feasible by 2012?
No, the short answer would be implementing the entire, everything that we call the smart grid by 2012, no, I don't think would be possible. But that's probably not what they're doing. And I have no specific knowledge of what the Vermont utilities have applied for or what their business plans are. But typically, utilities, I can't think of a single utility anywhere in the world that isn't moving to the smart grid in stages. That is, the ultimate smart grid will have a tremendous amount of functionality in every customer's home, lots of price signals, lots of control signals. They will manage their system differently. And to do that, the industry hasn't even adopted a lot of the standardization that allows the different parts of the smart grid to talk to each other and do all that. So, and it's going to take a number of years for them to figure that out. So that what utilities do appropriately is to adopt different parts of the smart grid or different functionalities in stages. And this is one of the things that makes regulation very, very hard, because it's sort of like upgrading your whole IT infrastructure in your company one section at a time. You don't rip the entire thing out and put a whole new one in overnight. Some companies do, but at least in my company, you know, we just replaced all the old laptops in this office, and then in the next one we replaced, next year the budget says replace the server, and so on. And analogously, utilities are doing that. Most of what I know is being funded in these DOE grants is the smart meters themselves. And that's a key part of the smart grid, but it's not the totality of the smart grid. And you have to have meters, but you put the meters in and you put some functionality to talk to them, but not all the functionality. And then you do the staging from there. This is a very hard thing for, you know, we work for utilities to try and run the numbers as to what should they do this year, and what should they do 3 years from now, and what should they use 6 years from now, and what should they do 10 years from now as they stage this out. And it's a fascinating challenge, but it's a difficult one.
Okay, maybe the real smart grid would have Peter Fox-Penner on Skype, you know, available to all utility executives and consumers in their home to give them advice about what to do next. But
I think not.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Peter, and thanks for bearing with us and getting this to happen, even though your flight was canceled or you missed the connection. And maybe we'll have you back again soon, and you can stay for lunch actually. So we'll bring the computer over into the next room and have more questions. So thanks again.
Sure.